Thank you for always availing your time to learn and share knowledge together. Just as a way of starting, there is a link that is on the chat. If you require CPD points, kindly follow that link and make sure that you complete your details there so that those points can be registered under your profile. Please note that these webinars are recorded so that those who are not able to attend can access them afterwards. So we will then begin by introducing our speaker. For those who don't know me, I must introduce myself as well, and I always forget this. I'm Dieketseng Ned. I head the Division of Disability and Rehabilitation Studies, and I'm pleased to be chairing this session today that is presented by my colleague, Prof. Brian Watermeyer, who's also in the Division of Disability and Rehabilitation Studies. Just briefly about our speaker today. Brian is an associate professor, as I said, in the Division of Disability and Rehabilitation Studies. He comes with a background from clinical psychology, which he completed at the University of Cape Town, and then completed his doctorate also in psychology, focusing though on disability studies at Stellenbosch University. Brian has blessed us with quite a host of texts that are very crucial in disability studies and broadly. His first book was entitled Disability and Social Change, a South African Agenda, and it was published by HSRC in 2006. Later in 2013, he also published a book with Ruth Legg titled Towards a Contextual Psychology of Disablism. And then recently in 2019, he also led the book entitled Handbook of Disability and Citizenship in the Global South. He has actually an extensive list of international journal publications, book chapters, as well as some media appearances in the as a disability scholar and activist. Brian also himself actually lives with a severe visual impairment, so he also comes with quite valuable lived experience of disability. He has professionally taught on a host of postgraduate programs at Stellenbosch University, at UCT, as well as the University of the Western Cape in a variety of programs such as disability studies, clinical psychology, general psychology, medicine, as well as rehabilitation sciences. And today, Brian is going to be sharing with us a presentation on health sciences training for disability inclusion, the need to engage with emotion. So we're going to give him just an hour of going through his talk, and then we will have 30 minutes for any comments and questions. But as he speaks, you are actually allowed to drop in any thoughts that are coming up in the chat room, so we can also then engage with those in case you forget them by the time he's done with his talk. So I'll be monitoring that chat space. So now, Brian, I'm going to hand over to you. Uh, and I have already shared your PowerPoint.
Right.
Let me just put it in slideshow. Okay. So over to you then. I am on slide 1 already.
Thank you so much, Dieketseng. Thank you for those very, very kind words. It's a great pleasure to be here. Thank you, and thanks for being here with me to talk about this issue, which is pretty close to my heart. So the title of this talk is Health Sciences Training for Disability Inclusion, the need to engage with emotion. And what this is about the question of whether we as a health sciences faculty are paying enough attention to training health professionals who are ready and prepared to go out into the world in a way which makes a contribution to the greater inclusion of people with disabilities in our society? Are they able to go out there in a way which fights ableist attitudes and ableist social formations, responding to disabled people in a way which is authentically empowering? Are we doing that? And how do we think about that? So that's what this is about. Dickert, thanks, said a little bit about me already. Just a couple of comments about how I come to this. I do come to this issue as a clinical psychologist by training. So I come to these things from a psychological point of view, in particular a psychoanalytic point of view, in fact. But I also come as a disabled person myself, someone who lives with severe visual impairment. So there's some standpoint perspectives there. And then I also come as a disability studies scholar who is working in a health sciences faculty. And, that's significant if we consider now, over the course of the last 40 years or so, disability studies, and before that, even medical anthropology as disciplines have been very critical of biological medicine, biomedicine, for the way it responds to disabled people, in particular, arguing that biomedicine's tendency towards focusing on the body, towards focusing on diagnosis and the drive for cure, to the exception of other things, has contributed to the pathologization of disabled people, which in turn has compounded or justified the marginality of disabled people across society. So what we're in the midst of here is a sort of an ongoing conversation between disability studies and health sciences. In the past, it's been a bit of a combative conversation. I've tried to overcome that and argued for a lot more generosity in our engagement with one another. I also position myself as a health professional as well, so I find myself in the middle of this discussion about how we think about disability in the context of health. So part of our role as disability studies academics here, Dickert Singh, myself, and all of our other colleagues, is to develop and grow a conversation around disability inclusion and how to think about it in health sciences, which might involve transforming health sciences curricula in a way which becomes more cognizant of disability as a social justice and inclusion issue. And that means trying to move towards transformative teaching in terms of disability inclusion. So what I'm going to do over the next hour or so is to sketch some debates around these issues, some theoretical positions as well as my position on some of these debates. And then I'm going to say a little bit as well about how over the course of the last sort of couple of decades, I have developed sort of my own methods of teaching disability in health sciences contexts with this aim of transformation. And number 2, please, Dee. So a couple of introductory comments. I mean, it's beyond debate that disability exclusion and the systemic disempowerment and marginalization of disabled people is a global and urgent problem. And the oppression of disabled people, it has a couple of different faces. Primarily we tend to think about the material face of disability oppression, which is in terms of the deprivation of essential resources and services, the kind of bricks and mortar deprivations and social disadvantages of disabled people. And I'm talking about access to resources such as housing, accessible built environments, appropriate social services, jobs, and so on. These material aspects of oppression are extremely important and urgent, and I don't in any way detract from that, quite the contrary. But what I want to point out here is that the psychological level of disability oppression, the ways in which at the psychological and relational level inequality is maintained, that is often not paid enough attention. And so that's what I'm seeking to do now. And this is the level of prejudice the level of how we feel about disabled people, and consequently how we as a society respond to the disability community. As health professionals, we are particularly called, I think, to take responsibility for these issues. And we should lead in terms of disability inclusion, because we are, as I will argue later, potentially extremely important figures in the lives of disabled people, and consequently important figures in the growth and development of the disability movement as a whole. We think sometimes as health professionals that all of these things to do with prejudice, discrimination, and inequality, sometimes we think we're a little bit above these debates and that we don't need to think about them very much ourselves. That's not the case. I hope we're beyond that idea now. The reality is that disability is a form of difference. And difference is something which, as human beings, we all struggle with. We battle with difference. We don't respond to it well. We don't manage it well. We tend to manifest our struggle with difference in creating social divisions and inequalities of all sorts. And so as health professionals, there's no reason why we should be immune to that. We're not. And so, we need to take responsibility for that and reflect on how we fit into the story of disability inequality and what to do about it. When I think about training health professionals for disability empowerment, my point of departure is that we should be asking health professionals or health trainees to engage with the idea of disability, not as professionals, but first and foremost, simply as human beings, engaging with disability as the human issue that it is. Okay, so getting to all of that, let me begin by, can I have number 3, please, Dee? Begin by sketching a little bit of the global background of disability, inequality, and disadvantage. I mean, what is the problem out there? Let me paint that picture for a moment. So if we look around the world, excuse me, if we look around the world, what we see is a dreadful and consistent picture of systemic exclusion, socioeconomic disadvantage, and discrimination surrounding the lives of disabled people. And it really is a worldwide phenomenon, which is only, and real recognition of this phenomenon and the urgent need for redress is a relatively new conversation in our human rights discourse. While this inequality exists all over the world, in rich countries as well, it tends to be more severe in countries of the global south, and that is in fact where most disabled people reside. So some of the features of the situation of inequality are the following. Well, there's a consistent pattern of low educational attainment of disabled people around the world. And, this is a result of education systems which are neglectful or unable to provide accessible education to children with disabilities. Very often children with disabilities are simply, face a kind of flat exclusion from the education system. And of course, we'll understand that low educational attainment translates very quickly into lives struggling to become involved in the economy. In other words, rendering very high levels of unemployment, again, in rich and poor countries alike, and the reality of disabled people being massively overrepresented amongst the poorest strata in most societies. So add to that the reality of problems of access to essential services and resources faced by disabled people around the world. And here I'm talking about essential services such as accessible and appropriate healthcare, such as the absolutely pivotal issue of accessible transportation services, which are so absolutely elemental to participation in the economy, as well as the reality of for disabled people, of facing a built environment which is largely remains inaccessible to people with physical disabilities, also people with sensory impairments, intellectual disabilities. Then the reality of a lack of access to appropriate and accessible housing. Also, the often under-recognized issue of access to information, which for people with sensory impairments and physical impairments, also people with intellectual disabilities, access to information which is available and intelligible is an enormous issue, which has implications for the capacity to take up one's full rights as a citizen, for civic participation, participation in the economy, entrepreneurial activity, education, and a lot more. So what all this adds up to is a situation in which disabled people face very limited, a majority of disabled people around the world, as reflected in the World Report on Disability, published by the WHO in 2011, face very limited participation in what we would call the life of the community. Number 4, please, Dee. So if we face this dreadful set of circumstances in terms of the social predicaments of disabled people around the world, the obvious question is why? How on earth did things get like this? What's the explanation? And well, the short answer is the reality that we live in societies, including South Africa, which are absolutely ridden with unnecessary, avoidable, and often unnoticed barriers to the full participation of disabled people. Our societies are full of barriers which exclude disabled people from taking part in all of the activities which we would consider sort of very basic parts of civil participation. And that is by dint of the fact that societies like ours were created in terms of their structures, their procedures, their devices, policies, technologies. Societies were created with only the needs of non-disabled people in mind. So many of the things we use and we participate in and we inhabit as part of being part of education, of the economy, of the world of work, of the life of the community, those environments were created with only the needs of non-disabled people in mind. And that means that as a disabled person, one moves through society constantly bumping up against experiences of an environment, an activity, a technology, a way of being, an activity to be part of, which is not accessible, not available, not able to be participated in by a disabled person. And in the worlds of disabled people, and I've heard this over the course of many years of qualitative data collection, if you have that experience of bumping up against environments which clearly were not created with your needs in mind, it's a very short step from there to feel uncertain about whether you belong in the society or in the community at all. So what I'm describing there are all of the material barriers to participation. And as I said earlier, absolutely key and important, and those things need to be addressed as a matter of social justice. But as I also said later, often we neglect the psychological level of disability inequality and neglect the fact that, in fact, psychological and material layers of disability oppression intersect with one another. And I would argue that the fact that we organize society materially in ways which exclude disabled people systemically often is a product of what happens at the psychological level. It's a product of our attitudes about disabled people. It's a product of our feelings about disability. So this is the level of disability prejudice which we need to work at. Number 5, please. So prejudice. How do we combat disability prejudice? Well, if we look back at the disability studies literature, we see that, well, going back to the 70s and 80s, 1970s and 80s, how long ago was that? We saw that there was this thing called awareness training as disability and awareness of disability inequality was growing. And awareness training were these courses that were based on the assumption that the disability inequality and exclusion was simply a product of a lack of awareness. If we just know more about disability, that inequality will kind of fade away. Unfortunately, that was found to not be the case. Sometimes we feel that political correctness is the answer, and if we just know the right sort of politically correct terms around disability, or perhaps if we adhere to particular, I don't know, sort of behavioral protocols about how to be around disabled people, that the dreadful reality of disability inequality will kind of dissolve away. Again, it doesn't. And it's because it seems as though there's something more at work, something deeper, something more complex, something more stubborn is at work in maintaining disability exclusion. And I'll say a tiny bit about this more, but I'll explain in more depth later. Evidence of that something more is to be found in the fact that disability makes us nervous. We feel awkward about it. We feel embarrassed. We feel uncertain about how to be around disability. And the argument, a theoretical argument, is that this is because exposure to disability has the capacity in the balance of society, if you like, what is sometimes called the non-disabled dominant group in society. Exposure to disability has the capacity to prick in the observer universal existential anxieties that we all carry. In other words, parts of the human condition, which we don't like to think about, which disabled people remind us of. And so the argument is that if disability and exposure to disabled people, or the idea of disability, pricks these unconscious anxieties for us, that may in turn elicit responses from us, thoughts, feelings, and behaviors from the balance of society, which serve to compound exclusion, which serve to try and create distance between non-disabled and disabled people. And if we look through the history of disability exclusion, that is the name of the game, is you see the creation of distance and aversion, what feels like an instinctual aversion to disabled people, and the creation of distance inside societies across the world, literally for millennia. But more on this a bit later. Where to now? So if we're going to combat prejudice, disability prejudice, let's think for a moment about what the content of that prejudice might be. I mean, what are the ableist ideas that we tend to carry? Number 6, please. So I call this disability medicine and common sense, and the juxtaposition of medicine and common sense might seem surprising, but I express it that way because, in fact, ideas and understandings of disability, of how disability works and what it does, there's quite a lot of commonality in those understandings between sort of common sense views out there in the world and a dominant applied medical view of disability, or a prevalent medical view of disability, put it that way. So if you were walking down a road in Cape Town or in Stellenbosch, for example, and you ask someone, a stranger, to talk about disability, say, tell you what their view was about what disability is, and about what it does, how it works, what the phenomenon of disability is, it's very likely that the answer would be something like the following. It would be the idea that, disability involves disorder of the body, something wrong or malfunctioning with the body, or perhaps the mind, which results in an individual being incapable of participation in society. So there's a kind of a functional relationship between something wrong with the body or the mind and an inability to participate. And there's a sense that, well, it's very unfortunate, and and we wouldn't want it to be that way, but people with disabilities simply are unable to participate in society. There'll be ideas probably flanking this logic, ideas to do with a sense of tragedy, a sense of something terribly unfortunate, but irrevocable, as well as ideas of inability, ideas of damage. And it's also very likely that somewhere hanging around in the conversation, there'll be a sense of shame which attaches to this idea of disability. So what this common sense view does is it denies the role of ideology. In other words, it denies any consideration of our attitudes, thoughts, and feelings about disability, and also denies the ways in which we have organized our society in a way which systemically excludes disabled people. It denies all of those aspects in determining the social destiny of disabled people, and attributes the social destiny, in other words, a marginal one, of disabled people purely to the nature of their bodies. In other words, failing to see disability in any way as a matter of social injustice, but rather simply as a matter of the nature of the body. And of course, what we're seeing here is, in the common sense view, is evidence of the much maligned and also much misunderstood idea of the medical model of disability. And I'd say much misunderstood because, well, it's the view, the idea of the medical model, the term is unhelpful, because it has in the past been understood as a negative way of thinking about disability, which is held by all medical professionals, which is of course nonsense. And as a health professional myself, understandably, many other health professionals have felt that to be some sort of a slur. So instead of an attitude or a way of thinking about disability which is held by medical professionals, health professionals exclusively or altogether, a medical model view is in fact the predominant view which we have been taught, the predominant way we've been taught to think about disability across society, and that's the one which prevails overwhelmingly out there in the world. In terms of the medical model in relation to health professionals, particularly, as I said, it doesn't at all apply to all health professionals, and in fact is better thought about as a particular kind of clinical stance, which one may or may not adhere to. And I imagine most health professionals would not, and be very sort of critical of a medical model view, a particular clinical stance which one may or may not hold in relation to disability. However, having said that, I would also argue that the nature of our health institutions, which can be hierarchical, they can even be authoritarian, situations where people work under under enormous amounts of pressure. Also, our health trainings, which can be very demanding. Also, situations in which trainees are exposed sometimes daily to high levels of trauma, that those circumstances can create conditions in which a medical model view becomes supported or becomes the only one available, because it's difficult in those pressurized circumstances to think beyond the simplicity of a medical model view. The worry about that is that the extent to which health professionals carry or enact this medical model view implies the possibility of it being communicated to patients, to disabled patients who they work with. And what's happening here is the communication of an idea that impairment of the body inevitably leads to a life of social exclusion. The medical model view is seductive because it presents itself as a kind of natural reality. It's as though it's sort of the natural order of things, not a particular, if you like, politically loaded view of disability, but just sort of the way things are. We all know that disability is unfortunate, it's tragic, but it inevitably leads to a life of social exclusion. It masquerades as the natural order of things, and in fact, it's not. Number 70. Rather than being the natural order of things, when it comes to ableist ideas, a medical model view, these are attitudes which we have been taught through our lives through a process of what one might call ableist socialization. In other words, as in the case with racism, and I think we've thought about this sort of much more clearly, we know that in a society which, in terms of race, is as perverse as ours has been and continues to be, we know that we've all grown up bombarded by messaging, by signals, which have racist implications, which have racist inferences to do with them. And consequently, we've all, I would argue, by virtue of living in this perverse and divided society, internalized, emotionally loaded, differential ideas about people of different colors. Ideas about what people's feelings are, what people's needs are, where people belong, what people's potentials are. And coming out of that, it's all of our responsibility, and I imagine that people would agree, it's our responsibility to, as individuals, engage in a process of reflection about what we've taken in through our socialization in this racist society, and to bring those feelings and ideas to the fore, process them, make sense of them, understand where they came from, and from that point, begin to be able to let them go, move beyond them. And so disability is no different in terms of the fact that we've also, although we're not aware of it, been steeped in a world which has particular values and ideas about disability intrinsic to it. And so these ideas about disability have been present throughout our lives in our formative relationships with parents, in our family, in cultural representations of disability, which have been all around us all of our lives, in the simple reality of how society is organized. And think, for example, in terms of race and apartheid, the simple but massive material signal which comes to us through the segregation of races. Before anything is said, we are shown that people of a particular color belong over there and people of a different color belong over here. That is a massive signal. Now, the story of disability is the story of apartheid-style segregation on a global scale, where disabled people have been separated, excluded, institutionalized in special schools, concealed in communities. There's a pattern of segregation. And so just at that level, just a very signal before a word is spoken that disabled people don't belong with the rest of us is a very powerful part of our socialization, informing how we feel about disabled people and what we think disabled people need and are capable of. So we've all internalized ideas about what disability is, sort of ideas and assumptions about what it's like to have a disability. We believe we know something about that. We've internalized ideas about what disability makes one into as a person, what one's value is as a disabled person. And very importantly, we've all internalized ideas about what both the needs of disabled people and the potentials of disabled people are. What makes this all so powerful is that, again, as in racism, until we examine these beliefs, until we kind of stop and think and reflect, these beliefs and assumptions are invisible. We don't know that we're racist until we stop and have a conversation with others and with ourselves, and have an exploratory process of introspection, which asks, how do I feel around people of particular racial identities? Similarly, with disability, until we stop and introspect, we don't know that we carry these attitudes and we will continue to enact them. Beliefs about disability also might be difficult to let go of because they may be flanked by emotionally laden parts of our own identity. And what I mean by that, and if there's time, I'll get to this a bit more later, is that a dominant non-disabled group in society, in terms of its own identity, its identity as whole, as able, as capable, as included, as not damaged, part of maintaining that identity involves requiring the disability community as an other who can be set up as the ones who are really damaged, who are really incapable, who are inevitably will be excluded. And setting us up, setting a non-disabled majority, setting itself up in terms of its identity against that is part of what props up a sense of oneself as capable, as included, as whole, as not damaged. And of course, this distinction, as we'll see, is an illusion. Number 8, please.
Just to alert you that you are in your 30 minutes mark.
Thanks very much, Steve. So where this is directing us is that, in my view, change in terms of ableist attitudes, it requires personal and emotional shift. Not just a cognitive change, but something of a much more personal nature. I spoke at the beginning about health training, health sciences training, which asks trainees to engage with disability as a human being before as a health professional. And so, as a demonstration of this, and this is a piece of research which I found very helpful. This is the work of 2 scholars called Broderick and Lalvani, and they are working in an area analogous to what I'm talking about now. They are in education and people who are involved in research into teacher training, in other words, training school teachers. And their work was discovering what it is that trainee teachers need in order to be equipped as they go out into the world to make a meaningful contribution to the full inclusion of people with disabilities in society, of children with disabilities in their classes, to fight ableist attitudes and behave in ways which are empowering to disabled people. They were curious about, well, what do we need to do in teacher training to make that happen? And so what they did was they took a cohort of teachers and they put them through a very substantial and rigorous tuition course in disability as a social justice issue, describing some of the dreadful realities of disability exclusion, socioeconomic deprivation, and discrimination that I described earlier, which happen around the world, helping teachers understand disability as a matter of inequality, as a matter of social justice, thinking about how that injustice is maintained, and so on. But this was a cognitive and an intellectual exercise, knowledge about disability as a social inequality issue. And what they found, to their disappointment, was that it didn't shift people's feelings about disability very much at all. And perhaps because of that, on close assessment, it didn't shift people's beliefs about disability, people's assumptions about disability either. Their trainee teachers continued, for example, to see disability purely as an issue of deficit, and even more importantly, continued to attribute social disadvantage experienced by disabled people purely to the nature of their bodies. In other words, holding on to that common sense / medical model view that the social destiny of disabled people, a marginal social destiny, is the inevitable consequence of bodies that are disordered or malfunctioning or different in some way. So again, what this points to is the need for, if you like, transformative experiential learning processes which work at the level of emotion, not just at the level of cognition. So if we're going to try and create those transformational learning experiences working at the level of emotion, what would the subject matter of those be? I mean, how do we begin to approach that? To do that, I'm going to go back to some theoretical ideas about the emotional underpinnings of disability prejudice in order to illuminate perhaps what we need to change. Number 9, please, Dee. So here, introducing what has come to be called a critical psychoanalytic view of disability oppression. So drawing on critical psychoanalysis, thinking about unconscious psychological influences on the way in which we as individuals and collectively as society respond to the disability community. How do we make sense of this? Or what's being implied here? So, as I said earlier, disability, what's noticeable, ubiquitous about disability, is that it raises anxiety in us. It makes us nervous. We feel awkward. We feel uncertain, embarrassed. We're not quite sure how to behave. It prickles anxiety in all of us, and there's no shame in that. It is, it's more or less universal. And so, the question is not whether we feel that. We almost certainly do. The question is, can we create an environment in which we can reflect on it, understand it, understand its underpinnings, and begin to move beyond it. Disability, in short, it presses our buttons. As I began to say earlier, what this is argued to be evidence of is how disability stirs unconsciously held struggles that we have. It pricks our insecurities and our vulnerabilities. In particular, it's argued that exposure to disability evokes in us universal ideas we have, universal feelings we have, and conflicts we have about the nature of the human condition, universal existential anxieties. In other words, the difficult parts of what it's like to be human, things we don't like to think about, is what disability and disabled people remind us of. That sounds a bit sort of, heady and lofty. It's not at all. What are the universal existential anxieties I'm talking about? Well, they're as basic as the following. They are our universal anxieties about the reality of our bodily frailty, the fact that our bodies are vulnerable and impermanent, they're susceptible to disease, the reality that we will all age, our bodies are deteriorating. Also, anxieties to do with the fact that as humans, we are universally vulnerable, and I mean, at this particular moment in history, we see the reality of human vulnerability all around us. Disability also reminds us of the fact of our fundamental interdependence on one another. We like to pretend that we are independent, but a closer look reveals that we are all deeply interdependent on one another, and particular kinds of physical dependency will probably grow as we age and our bodies deteriorate. That's something, again, which we struggle with, which we don't want to think about. That leads up to, the sort of basic fear, which is the reality of the mortality of our bodies and the fact that our lives will end, our bodies are impermanent. Also something which, needless to say, we don't like to think about. So that in terms of a broad sort of shared existential struggle, set of existential struggles that disability brings back into awareness for us, an unwelcome awareness. But also at a personal level, disability has the ability to awaken in us insecurities we have about our personal identity. And so, for example, difficult feelings which most of us have about our attractiveness, the nature of our bodies. Are our bodies, desirable? Are they lovable? Are we lovable the way our bodies are? Insecurities about our abilities, our intellect. Are we sufficiently clever? Can we compete with others? Will we succeed? Will we be accepted by peer groups and so on? So by virtue of a world of symbolic, cultural, religious, and other representations of disability over the course of centuries, representations which have sort of unerringly frame disabled people as fundamentally damaged, as unable to participate, as shame-ridden. By virtue of all of those representations of disabled people over the course of centuries, these universal existential anxieties have become sort of culturally attached to disabled people. And so these ideas are what disabled people remind us of. Which has all sorts of implications, because how we feel about disabled people, and it's the crux of what I'm trying to say, how we feel about disabled people as individuals and as a collective have massive implications in terms of how we choose to organize our society. And in particular, what we see is societies organized in ways which exclude disabled people in a systemic way. Number 10, please. Why is it that disabled people, why is it that we have these personal insecurities that disabled people evoke? What are those about? We like to believe that we are sort of infallible, but I imagine most of us don't believe that, in our more secret lives. And we all harbor insecurities and uncertainties about our identity, about our value, about our worth, about our attractiveness, about our acceptability. And we all have those insecurities because of the reality of what I call the bumpy road of human development. Growing up is hard. And as we grow up, we face a range of challenges from early life, for example, the frightening complete dependency of infancy, to the challenges of young childhood, of the frightening nature of having to separate from parents and face the world, an uncertain and a frightening world. The difficulty of having to move into peer relationships at school, uncertainties about whether we'll be accepted into those groups. The reality of beginning to have to compete with others and discovering that, at school, we have to be clever enough. And will we be acceptable and do well enough in those circumstances? Maybe as teenagers, as is often the case, we become aware of anxieties about our bodies. Something is always too big or too small or too hairy or too hairless, and we spend a lot of time in front of the mirror. And then perhaps in adulthood, anxieties about whether we will find a job, be able to support ourselves, be able to live independently, find a spouse, and so on. Growing up is hard, and at every one of those moments, and many others I've described, there will be experiences which left us feeling inadequate, abject, lacking in value, helpless, worthless. That's part of growing up for all of us. Besides that, in every life, there will be those experiences punctuated by losses as well, losses and traumas as well. And so what this boils down to is the reality that inside of all of us, we carry unconsciously memories of painful experiences, and more importantly, the feelings associated with those experiences and the parts of ourselves in which we still harbor deeply held insecurities about ourselves. All of this exists, the memories and the feelings exist largely in our unconscious lives. And the reason for that is because we're not able to hold these things consciously because they're not tolerable. And in order to be able to carry on with our lives and put one foot in front of the other, we need to send much of our emotional life underground. And that is what we do. These ideas and memories are kept unconscious so that we can carry on functioning. Also, added to that, we live in a society where, which is dominated by what has been called a sort of late modern narcissism, which is very prevalent in societies around the world, particularly ones which have been penetrated by capitalist markets, which is a narcissistic way of being, which asks us to be autonomous, which demands that we create and recreate our bodies and our lifestyles in terms of some sort of perfection, which is based on commodification, based on rampant materialism, and awareness, or much less expression, of vulnerability is something which is not allowed in terms of that narcissistic world. It's something which is frowned on. We are taught from a very early age to keep our uncertainties and our insecurities, to keep our awareness of the more painful aspects of the human condition to ourselves. And so disabled people, as an alternative to that, come to be experienced as the reminders and the symbols of all of these parts of our own lives which we are not able to think about. From that, disabled people then become containers for the projections of those feelings. In other words, individually and collectively, we come to experience the disability community as the custodians of those parts of ourselves we don't want to think about, as the custodians of damage, of inability, of shame, of abjection. Disabled people framed as damaged, as shameful, as incapable. And if that is the reality, it's not surprising that if we look through history, we see a consistent pattern of attempts to distance ourselves from disabled people. The dominant group in society attempting to distance itself from disabled people, and that involves concealing disabled people, and involves distancing through institutionalization or other means. It also involves the control of disabled people in all sorts of ways. The massive ideology of segregation of disabled people, and the drive to normalize or correct disabled people to try and make everyone as uniform as possible. So I would argue that in some of these more extreme responses to disability around the world throughout history, but also in our personal feelings about disability and responses to disabled people, there's a sort of a thread of madness, which is born of this need to defend against what it is that disability evokes in us. I'll talk about some of the more mad responses throughout history to disabled people. Well, broad-based social responses such as segregation, such as the long and often brutal history of institutionalization of disabled people, segregation into special schools. More extreme measures such as the forced sterilization of disabled people, which was very prevalent in many parts of the world throughout the last century, and almost certainly continues illegally or unethically in many parts of the world today, as well as the sort of more horrific broad end of the wedge, which is the reality of the eugenic extermination of disabled people. And I'm talking about the murder of an estimated 250,000 disabled people by the Nazis in the 1940s, who were killed because they were disabled and were regarded as life unworthy of life. Throughout all of this, though, again, at the collective level and at the local community level, what is consistent is the ubiquity of exclusion of disabled people. And we all have to consider what our contribution to that is. Number 11. So saying a little bit about health professionals in the lives of disabled people. A first consideration here is that disabled people suffer internalized oppression on a large scale. And by internalized oppression, what I mean is that disabled people, through being steeped in an ableist world, through having a socialization into ableist assumptions such as the rest of us have very often internalized self-limiting or self-devaluing ideas about their human potential and about their capacity to live fulfilling lives. So disabled people consequently are vulnerable. Many are in that sense, particularly people with congenital disabilities, because of already carrying negative assumptions, beliefs, deeply held ones, about their own potential and capacity for full participation. In fact, if we look at the disability movement around the world over the course of the last half century or so, we will find that its gains have been pretty modest, I would argue. And that's partly because the political mobilization of disabled people has been a very difficult thing to do because of internalized oppression. And I would argue that internalized oppression is at times more stubborn and more deeply held in disabled people than in, for example, communities who suffer racism and exposure to racist stereotypes. And the reason for that is because most congenitally disabled people grow up as the only disabled person in the family or possibly in the local community. And what that means is that unlike members of communities experiencing racism, that disabled person is a minority of one and doesn't have anyone else around who shares the same experience, who has the capacity to validate that experience and can help one see through or see into the reality of prejudiced treatment or discriminatory treatment one is receiving. Instead, it just becomes that discriminatory treatment might be sort of just the way things are and the way they've always been. So disabled people vulnerable in that sense through already potentially carrying negative ideas, particularly congenitally disabled people already carrying negative ideas about their own potential and capacity and entitlement to participation. And so add to that, health professionals are, I argue, in potentially powerfully influential positions in the lives of disabled people. So, let's think about a couple of situations. For example, the unexpected arrival of an infant with a disability to a couple, the birth of an infant with a disability. Or perhaps an adult who has an acquired disability through some sort of trauma, disease, or accident. In both of these situations, it's an experience of extreme levels of stress and trauma, where I would argue part of what happens is that the future becomes profoundly uncertain. For that couple who've given birth to an infant with a disability, maybe it's an infant with a Down syndrome or any number of possibilities, cerebral palsy. Because they, like the rest of us, have lived in worlds of segregation, it means that they are very unlikely to have ever had the experience of living alongside adults who live with the disability that their child now has, adults who are living full and fulfilling lives with disability. They won't have had that experience or any evidence that that is possible. And so consequently, the anxieties about the future of our child, about what we can hope for, about what her place in the world might be, about how the world will respond to her, what the potential is for her to support herself, to find a place to belong, to have fulfilling relationships. There's a sort of a vacuum in that place where we don't know what the future is. Similarly, with an adult with acquired disability, it's as though I'm completely uncertain now as to my capacity to fulfill all the roles that make up my identity. My role as, say, this is a man, my role as a father, my role in the community, my role in my religious organization, in my workplace. And so because I'm unsure now about my capacity to fulfill those roles, I'm unsure about what to expect in my future. What is my place now? Again, I haven't had an experience of living alongside people with my form of disability. Where do I belong now? Where do I end up? What are my entitlements? What can I hope for? This is the silence into which the attitudes and feelings about disability of health professionals speaks. It speaks into that silence. And speaking with the authority, literally or figuratively, of the white coat. And situations in which it's not only the words of health professionals that can make powerful impressions here, but also, even perhaps more powerfully, the actions, which at an emotional level, at a pre-conscious level, communicate feelings and ideas about what disability means, about the potential for human flourishing and the fulfilling life of disabled people, and the entitlement to inclusion of disabled people. Sometimes the influence of health professionals is in the context of relationships with disabled people, which can last years or even decades. And I'm thinking here, for example, of people with congenital disabilities who may grow up experiencing years of ongoing relationships with rehabilitation professionals through regimes of rehabilitation, which, for example, physiotherapy, occupational therapy, which may be painful, which may feel relentless, which may feel difficult. And what we see here is a situation in which some adults with disabilities in autoethnographic accounts in the disability studies literature describe growing up in the context of a kind of a medicalized socialization in these relationships with health professionals, where there's an experience of, while other children were playing or engaging in more childlike activities, if you like, more childhood appropriate activities, where instead one was required to engage relentlessly in regimes of rehabilitation, which, might have been painful, difficult, exhausting, which can lead to an experience of oneself, in the words of one disability studies scholar with this experience, experiencing oneself as a child as a problem to be solved, or perhaps a problem which can't be solved. Or in another account, someone describing how the experience of having to work harder and harder in rehabilitation while other children are playing in order to try and be less and less like myself. Powerful messages being signaled to disabled children here about damage, about the possibility of a fulfilling life, about how they ought to be, how these practitioners feel about disability in these contexts, what their own relationship with disability is, potentially profoundly important. Number 12. So, as we think about training health professionals for disability empowerment, well, there's a lot of research into this, and what we find, perhaps dishearteningly, evidence is mixed, but there is quite a bit of evidence that through the course of health sciences training, that a kind of cynicism about the life potentials of disabled people actually increases amongst medical trainees through their training. Cynicism about life potentials and the capacity for a fulfilling and flourishing life, as well as a kind of a decrease in empathy. And so what does it work here is, I believe, the work of the sort of hidden curriculum of a medical model view, which is buried in these busy curriculums, very cluttered curriculums, which we subject our trainees to necessarily, but problematically. Also in the hierarchical and sometimes authoritarian nature of health sciences trainings and health institutions, which make a medical model view a narrow view of disability, sometimes the only one for which there is mental space. Add to that the pressure placed on trainees who very quickly get shown that they are charged with cure. It's as though the expectation is that you are supposed to cure people, and this might not be said overtly, but it's there somewhere, powerfully there in the discourse. The idea of the body as a machine, a kind of Cartesian mind-body idea, the body as a machine, which sometimes breaks down and which you need to put right. Sometimes called the curative zeal of medicine. And what that can create is a situation in which disabled people, by definition, are incurable. And that might mean that the disabled individual then appears possibly as what? As a failure to the health professional because he or she can't be cured, Is there a kind of awkwardness about that because it feels anomalous? You know, a problem which cannot be solved is the position which the disabled person fills, or something hanging over the relationship with a disabled patient. Something which anthropologists call matter out of place, the sense of disability as a sort of an excess that won't fit, a square peg in a round hole. Add to that the reality that the attitudes and feelings about health professionals towards disabled people are undermined or troubled by the fact that health professionals overwhelmingly have contact with disabled people who are in situations of distress, trauma, illness, vulnerability, because it's in therapeutic contexts. And of course, what that can do is compound pre-existing ideas about the vulnerability, about the inability of disabled people, about their incapability to participate, the unlikelihood of disabled people having fulfilling lives. Social psychologists talk about something called the contact hypothesis, which is the idea that if different groups have prejudiced ideas about one another, that you just need to have contact between them. You just put them together, and if you put them together, things will get better, and stereotyped ideas and prejudices will fade away. What's been found is that that's not the case. What's important is the nature of the contact. And so people of different groups with prejudiced ideas about one another need to have equal status contact with one another, preferably working towards shared goals in order for prejudiced ideas to diminish. And of course, therapeutic contact is not equal contact. And that's mostly what health professionals have with disabled people. Beyond that, though, the growth of empathy in general, it requires, and I'm talking about empathy in health professionals, but as well as other people, it requires the capacity for self-reflection. In other words, the possibility of mental space, of a gentle space in which one can reflect on one's own feelings and one's own struggles, to bring them into view and to understand them better, because the better we understand how we feel, the less likely we are to act out how we feel in unconscious ways. So we need to understand what our feelings are. However, those often hierarchical, sometimes authoritarian health institutions militate very directly against self-reflection through the demanding environments, the trauma-ridden environments which our health professionals work in, where possibly feeling or expressing distress might be something which is shamed in those environments. What that does is create situations in which health professionals are not encouraged or not provided with environments which support the development of self-compassion. In other words, reflecting on one's own emotional stake in what's going on, one's own feelings, and developing some compassion for one's own predicament. And that's very important because, quite simply, we need to feel a sense of self-acceptance, of self-compassion, in order to, from there, be able to respond to others in an accepting and compassionate way. Quite simply, it's less likely and more difficult for us to respond to other people in a humane way if we are living in dehumanizing circumstances ourselves, circumstances which deny our own emotional life. I hope it's very clear that health professionals here need our compassion. I'm not in any way blaming them, not at all. Health professionals need our compassion, our understanding, and need contexts which are supportive in order to make sense of their own emotional experience in a way which allows them to make more space for empathy and understanding of the emotional experience of patients. And so part of what I do in my teaching is trying consciously to build compassionate self-reflection in health professionals. Number 13, please.
Hi, Brian. Just to alert you that we are left with just 20 minutes of the discussion time. So I would ask you to wrap up so that we can have that discussion time.
I've stayed too, I've been in too much detail. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to say a few words and then we're going to discussion time. Okay. Just a little bit about my teaching then. Number 13, please. So the emphasis is on self-reflection regarding disability. And this is grounded very heavily in my own story as a disabled person and health professional, bringing those two things together. Trying through making myself more visible as a disabled person to model a kind of easy engagement with awkward feelings about disability. And what I do from there is, and this will be the last thing I say, is ask students to reflect on what I call their disability story. And that's the story of their own lives as people who have undergone a disability in related socialization. In other words, all of the messages and experiences that have led to the internalization of particular ideas about disability over the course of a lifetime. Experiences in communities, in religious organizations, in families, in the media and cultural representations of disability, which have left particular beliefs and assumptions and feelings about disability internalized in the inner lives of those students. Students who are able to reflect openly on these, and we talk about them in a way which allows students to understand more deeply how their own feelings of vulnerability in their own lives sometimes get muddled up with what they imagine the vulnerability of disabled people to be, which renders expectations and ideas about disabled people as being inevitably vulnerable, as being unable to participate, as having lives which are unable to be flourishing, fulfilling, and involve real inclusion. Disability studies writers have talked about our disabled imaginations and how difficult it is living in a disabled world, an exclusionary world, to imagine that a world could be organized in a way in which disability inclusion is a reality, in which real participation of disabled people is possible. It is possible. Part of what all this shows up is how our need to distance ourselves from disabled people is not because of the difference between ourselves and disabled people, but actually because of how similar we are. And the reality is that it's human vulnerability which doesn't divide us. It is in fact what connects us up as a human family. The more we can understand that, the better it is for inclusion. Also, because disability and the vulnerability and impermanence of the body is something which actually unites all of us. It awaits all of us. It's part of all of the human condition. It's in all of our interests to contribute to creating a society which is more accepting, more welcoming of bodily difference, because it's going to be in all of our interests. As inevitably disability visits itself on us, on our family, as we age, as we go through the realities of the universal vulnerability and impermanence of our bodies. Thank you, Dee. I think I'll leave it there and have some time for discussion.
Thank you so much, Brian, for such an insightful presentation. I understand there's still a lot more to unpack, but perhaps you could allow Chanel to share the slides with the team so that they can read the remaining. I think you still had about 3 or 4 slides.
Thanks, that's great.
We already have one comment in the chat. Perhaps we can start with that. And if anyone else would like to follow, you can just raise your hand and then I will come to you. The comment on the chat, Brian, from Juliet Nyasulu is that, thanks, Prof, a great presentation and eye-opener on disability and inclusivity. You should have a better understanding of how inclusive our faculty is. Where do you think we lag behind and what would you recommend? Or what do you say as a highlight of what to do differently in our faculty to endorse or promote inclusivity in our training?
Thanks very much, Prof. Nyasulu, for that question. Part of the work we are doing as the Disability and Rehabilitation Studies Division not just in this faculty, but across the university, is trying to grow an organization-wide conversation about disability inclusion as an issue which is not a sort of an add-on, where special services performed by particular units in particular areas of the university are responsible for creating access, but instead thinking about disability inclusion as something which is which is everyone's responsibility. Even at very much the micro level of how we relate in our departments to our colleagues, to our students, and so on. And coming out of what I've been saying earlier, this is difficult. But the most important single thing one can do as one begins to move towards creating a culture of inclusion is that personal engagement with the question of what my feelings are about disability, what my own relationship is with disability. And as I said, it's very analogous to the reality with racism. We know that there's personal work to do around racism, and we've been trying to do it for a long time. Heaven knows there's a lot of work still to do, put it mildly. But we know that it's at the personal level that work needs to be done. Doing that work and understanding and processing and taking responsibility for our own feelings about disability, or more precisely, what it is about ourselves that disability raises in us, allows us to put those feelings aside so that a situation is created where the air between ourselves and, say, a disabled patient is no longer clouded with a kind of a cloud of emotion and confusion related to our own emotionally laden assumptions about what disability means. A situation which runs the risk of silencing the voice of the patient or of the student or of the colleague. I mean, another big issue I would want to underline is the need to have much bigger representation of disabled people within the ranks of health professionals, as well as in the ranks of health sciences academics. I mean, in terms of health professionals, to me, it's a kind of a no-brainer. Obviously, we know that if we are going to, that we need representativity of people with a range of identities, be they race-based, gender identities, ethnic, linguistic identities. We know that we need representation in the ranks of health professionals if we are going to create health services which are attuned to the experiences and needs of those groups. And the same thing applies in terms of disability. There is a strange sort of reluctance and dubiousness within health institutions around the world, which has been noted in terms of including health professionals in the rank, disabled people in the ranks of health professionals, but it's something which we need to do if we are going to create health services more attuned to the needs of the disability community. Thanks for that question. I hope that helps.
Thank you so much, Brian. Any other comments, questions? Perhaps I could ask you a question, Brian, while we wait.
Sure.
I know that you spoke about issues of disability awareness, and you spoke about how you actually try and facilitate that in your own teaching. From my own experience, I know that some people use quite a lot of simulations as a way of raising disability awareness, or even sensitizing people to disability. But there has been some critiques with that, where you blindfold people and you make them sort of experience how it is like to be a blind person, or people are given wheelchairs and they have to navigate with their wheelchairs, self-propelling themselves as a way of sort of giving them that sense of how it feels like to navigate a wheelchair. I know that there has been some critiques from critical disability studies scholars about how that actually doesn't achieve the purpose that it's intended to achieve, but rather invokes quite a lot of feelings of pity, in the sense that I could be feeling after being given that small chance of self-propelling myself with a wheelchair or being blindfolded, then I sort of start feeling some sense of pity or some feelings of, the thought that one would think, um, my life is better than than this, so I shouldn't complain. Think there are people who are going through the worst, and those feelings then sort of perpetuate those pity, shameful type of feelings that we should be challenging when it comes to raising awareness or sensitizing people to disability. What are your own thoughts about that strategy of simulations?
Yes, thanks, Dee. So very controversial simulation exercises, where, as you say, people are blindfolded to have an experience for a while of what it's like to be visually impaired, or required to go around a campus in a wheelchair as a wheelchair user. It seems like a good idea on the surface, but in fact, as you've alluded to, it's often problematic. And that's because, for example, if someone who is a non-disabled person, a sighted person, is asked to survive for some time, or operate or function without sight, maybe, blindfolded in a simulation, what that can often create is, a heightened sense of anxiety, because it feels impossible, because that person probably very anxious. They have an experience of, oh my goodness, this is impossible. How can I function? This is incredibly difficult. And what that can do is actually inadvertently compound ideas about the low potential for a fulfilling life and full participation of disabled people. Because what's happening then is not an experience of what the world of my visually impaired colleague might be, because only she can tell me that. Instead, it's an experience of, what would it be like for me to have that experience? And that is something very, very different, you see, because in some ways it's calling to mind the very imaginings about disability which are the problem, and creating a situation where, if the simulation is done in a not very sophisticated way, where almost the people involved are encouraged to believe that what I'm going through here is what it's like to have a visual impairment. It's not. It's not the same to be blindfolded for an hour. The experience one goes through through that experience is not the same as someone who has been adjusting to a world with visual impairment, for a decade. It's simply not the same at all. And so it can evoke a sort of pity response, which is laced with anxiety, I find that very unhelpful. Alternately, though, as I spoke about earlier, so many barriers to the participation of disabled people are invisible. We don't see them until we become aware of them. And so, for example, just moving through a university campus, maybe in a wheelchair in a simulation exercise, maybe not, but just moving through that campus, holding in mind what that environment might be like for someone with, say, a mobility impairment, or someone with a visual impairment. That can be a very powerful experience, because one will see, it's a sort of road to Damascus experience, which some people describe to me, where someone is, oh my goodness, I had no idea that all around us are barriers to participation, which are invisible, avoidable, unnecessary, unjust. I had someone who, a research participant in a qualitative study I did some years ago, who was a young man who had become disabled through a spinal injury. And he described his transition to life with disability as a crash course in social inequality. He said, I had no idea that all around us are these exclusionary barriers to participation. All around us is this inequality which is being maintained, but it's invisible because we don't see it until we stop and think about it. And so in that sense, building awareness of the way our society is organized in an exclusionary way, I mean, that's helpful. The idea that we can know what it's like to be disabled, I don't think that's helpful, because necessarily that's going to be some sort of stereotype. It's going to be some sort of projection. What we need to do instead is to sit down with our visually impaired colleague or our disabled student and listen. Open our ears, clear our feelings and assumptions away, open our ears, and listen to what their needs, experiences, feelings are, and how we can be part of creating a more inclusive environment in terms of that.
Thank you so much, Brian. Very interesting indeed. I don't see any other questions to you or comments. We don't have any hands either. So I don't know if maybe you want to share some last thoughts, maybe from what you didn't have a chance to share, and
Sure.
then we can close, maybe some
Sure.
closing remarks from you.
Sure. How much time have we got left?
Just 3 minutes.
Just 3 minutes or so. Well, I mean, if you go to my last slide, perhaps, Dee, I mean, this is a quote I like from the anthropologist Robert Murphy, someone who wrote what is now a classic autoethnography on disability. He experienced the progressive onset of quadriplegia due to spinal cancer and wrote about it as an anthropologist in an incredibly meticulous and thoughtful way. And this is a quotation from him that I like. Let me find it. Oh, there we are. He said the following: the greatest impediment to a person's taking full part in his, her, their society are not his physical flaws, but rather the tissue of myths, fears, and misunderstandings that attach to them. It's the tissue of myths, fears, and misunderstandings that attach to disability that are the most powerful issue here. And those are things which don't exist in the body of the disabled patient who we are working with. They are things that exist in ourselves, in our own socialization, and in our own unconscious emotional life. Myths, fears, and misunderstandings, we really do carry those. And again, there's no shame in that. As with racism, the question is not, do we have racist feelings? In the society, we all do. Racialized feelings, if you like. There's no shame in that. The question is, can we create environments for ourselves, conversations between health professionals at the training level and at the professional and institutional level, conversations in which it's possible to bring those feelings and those struggles to light in the context of an engagement which is self-compassionate, an engagement, the development of discussions within health institutions which foster self-compassion within and between health professionals about their own struggles, and in a way which clarifies the potential for our own feelings to get confused with what we imagine about the lives of disabled people who we tend to see in a stereotyped way as vulnerable. It's those myths and misunderstandings and fears. They are what we need to bring to the fore, what we need to understand and move beyond, and help our trainees move beyond, if we are going to create an environment of relating to disabled people in a way which is truly empowering, not only at the level of words and cognitions, but at the level of feelings and intentions as well. Okay, I think, is that our time? We're probably out of time.
Thank you so much, Brian. Once again, this was truly an insightful presentation. We've certainly learned a lot, and some of the comments here concur that with that. Just a reminder again, please remember to fill in the form if you'd like some CPD points. And thank you once again for joining this webinar today. We look forward to seeing you in the coming webinars that we still have for the rest of the year. And thank you to Chanel, especially for always organizing these webinars for us. Have a good day further.
Thank you, Dikit Singh. Thank you, Chanel. And thank you, everyone.